Hi, and welcome to The Stream. I'm Josh Rushing. Amid a climate emergency, the U.S. has approved a massive plan to drill for more oil and gas in Alaska. It's called the Willow Project. And this $8 billion development aims to extract at least 600 million barrels of oil from Alaska's North Slope over the next 30 years. Listen to what some Alaskan natives had to say about the project earlier this month at a protest outside the White House.
I am sad when you want to drill oil on my land, when I know that it will make the animals sick, the animals that my family needs to thrive on.
I have seen bully tactics to keep people quiet. Leaders raising their voice at youth, telling us we are brainwashed by Big Green, and individuals having their worth as an Inupiaq person torn apart publicly by their own community and families.
The man who lives in the big house across the street behind me campaigned for the presidency with promises of fighting climate change. President Biden, how do you want to be remembered? 50 years from now, 100 years from now? Do you want to be remembered and known as the president who put America on a path to showing and stopping climate change, or for helping ConocoPhillips increase profits at the expense of indigenous communities and the rest of the world?
So this week, The Stream is focusing on issues affecting climate change. And today, we're going to hear more about the Willow Project and the debate over continued oil development in the Arctic. With us to discuss this in Washington, D.C., Polly Dennett-Claw, a political correspondent who covers indigenous issues with Indian Country Today. In Anchorage, Alaska, Nagruk Hartcherek, president of the Voice of the Arctic Inupiat, that's a pro-development group based in Alaska's North Slope. And in Boston, we have Philip White, an assistant professor of history and Arctic and Northern Studies at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks. Hey, welcome to everybody. Nagruk, I want to begin with you because I know that those voices we heard at the top are not the only perspective here. You're from Alaska, from the North Slope. So can you tell us the upside of this project? What are the benefits it's going to bring there?
There are a lot of benefits through the taxation of the oil infrastructure that turns into revenues for the North Slope Borough that provides for first world living conditions in all of the communities on the North Slope. So water and sewer projects, police and fire protection, educational institutions, anything that a municipal government or a city government normally provides in more modern cities, the North Slope Borough does that for us on the North Slope and has been doing that for the last 50 years.
And to make it clear, you're pro-development. Polly, you've done some reporting with locals from up there that have a different point of view. What are the concerns that you've heard?
So the mayor of Nuksuk has been very outspoken, and Nuksuk is the community that is closest to where the development will actually be occurring. And after the Willow Project is fully completed, the community will be surrounded essentially by oil and gas development. And the Nuksuk community is mostly Inupiaq and is about 400 folks who live there. And some of the things that they have noticed is a change in migration when it comes to the animals that they use for subsistence hunting. Mm-hmm. And the migration patterns have changed. The mayor, Rosemary, noted that her son has to travel some 300 miles because of the migration changes of the caribou, and also noting that the permafrost in her community has been thawing, which has really affected the community. And there are a host of other issues that she testified before the Natural Resources Committee last year. So
the U.S. has a director of the Department of Interior that's actually a Native person for the first time, Deb Haaland, and she's the one that announced this. We actually have the video of her announcing this.
The president is taking action to limit new oil and gas leasing in important places in the Western Arctic and the Arctic Ocean. Second, the Interior Department will propose a rule that will recommend additional protections for more than 13 million acres in the area. These steps will protect wildlife, including caribou and polar bears, and guard the subsistence rights that are so important to Alaska Native communities. Third is the Willow Project, which is a difficult and complex issue that was inherited. These are existing leases issued by previous administrations as far back as the 90s. As a result, we had limited decision space, but we focused on how to reduce the project's footprint and minimize its impacts to people and to wildlife.
Hey, Philip, listening to Secretary Holland there, there's definitely a tonal shift on that third point. She seemed very reticent kind of announcing this. What are some of the politics that went into this, and why would the Biden administration that seemed to campaign on making climate change a priority, why did they do this?
Yeah, well, that's absolutely right. And just to start with Biden's campaign promise of no new oil leasing or development on federal lands. And so from that perspective, this looks like a major walkback from the Biden administration, and it really looks like they're trying to save face here. And I think that's why we see those other actions. But we also have to remember that Biden is a savvy political leader, and Alaska's congressional delegation has been very outspoken about wanting to see this project go forward. And that congressional delegation, especially Lisa Murkowski and Alaska's Congresswoman Mary Peltola, are really important for other federal decisions that need to be made for other, especially for Senator Murkowski, for judges that need to be confirmed. So this was certainly a political decision on the Biden administration's part, and you can tell that they're not particularly happy about it, but clearly they thought this was the most prudent political decision based on the context, especially the geopolitical context of the Ukraine crisis right now.
You know well, actually, I want to move on, but can you just touch on that for a second? Why did Ukraine change the political decision here?
Yeah. And so, the United States has historically, we had declining oil production ever since the 1970s. Because of slickwater hydraulic fracturing, it really created a kind of energy revolution in this country. And so we have been exporting vast quantities of LNG, liquefied natural gas, to Europe to help replace Russian natural gas. So the United States has played a new, more muscular role in European and global energy affairs. And there is the perception with this project that the United States needs to maintain a certain flow of energy to be able to support our allies. And that, you would see the Alaska delegation and others say that energy is best coming from domestic resources and from the state of Alaska.
So, McGurk, I'm going to bring this next question to you. I want to share my laptop with the viewers. I'm looking at a report from the IEA. This is the International Energy Association. They are very pro-energy. They came out with a report about how the world can get to net zero by 2050. And in this report, I'm going to share this here. It says there is no need for investment in new fossil fuel supply in our net zero pathway. McGurk, do you believe that new fossil fuel projects will lead the world to the tipping point for climate change faster?
I think that, we're in this transition period, and Biden himself mentioned that we're going to need the resource for at least 10 years. We could argue, I think, that it might be longer than that. So the choice to do it domestically, I think, is a good choice. We definitely appreciate it on the North Slope because of the economic benefits that projects like this provide to our communities. The only other option is to kind of outsource that to other countries. And I think that they're making the right choice with respect to this.
But back to the heart of that question, do you believe new projects will push the world closer to climate catastrophe?
Towards climate catastrophe, I don't think so. I think the U.S. is doing a great job as far as, the projects to reduce the climate footprint. I think one of the things we could do is produce natural gas. They mentioned the fracking down in the lower 48. That allowed for the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions within the United States. So I think if we do it responsibly, we could minimize whatever the effects are going to be going forward.
Well, people are talking about this on social media. Found this video on TikTok. This is Sunny Urgruna, and I want to share it with the audience.
Today, I am mourning the loss of biodiversity, the increase in permafrost thaw, the continued coastal erosion, and global sea rise. As a youth, I'm mourning the fact that we're losing years of our lives to dedicate to this advocacy work and the uphill battle that is ahead of us. I'm mourning the fact that we don't have the luxury of previous generations to push this responsibility of a transition away from fossil fuels and contending with worsening climate change onto future generations and the generations that come after us. We don't have the time to do that.
Polly, in your reporting, how do you reconcile, oh man, the emotions in that video, the concern that generation has, and not just that generation, about climate change and what's happening and not wanting to just give up, but also McGurk pointing out, the local economic benefit and that they need that there. How do you balance these?
So I think it's really important, especially when it comes to oil and gas development in indigenous communities. One, the fact of tribal sovereignty and self-determination, which is local indigenous governments and officials can decide what they choose to do with the land that they occupy. And so I think when we're having these conversations, it is really important to understand that tribal sovereignty and self-determination is having these indigenous leaders decide what they want to do. And part of this is that Alaska is a oil and gas state. And so the majority of the state's income comes from oil and gas revenue. And part of that too is that Alaska doesn't have a state income tax or sales tax. And those are also part of the conversation. And in the North Slope Borough, the majority of the revenues and tax revenues come from this development and projects like Willow. And in places that are so isolated, that don't often have, access to sort of economic development, these projects, it's reconciling both of these of, yes, the climate change is happening. And then also, these communities need jobs and tax revenues to continue to uplift and build their communities. And I think two things can be true at once.
Philip, I'm going to bring in some voices here from YouTube right now who are watching the show. This is Jerry Miller, who says people like to have a functioning economy where they can afford to live. TRC 23, Manitoba, Winnipeg says Indigenous people, Indigenous culture, Native Americans first. And then a few other people say it's about time we're drilling. And then 1 John 2:26 says this earth age will be long over by 2050. There's a sense of for the places that depend on oil and gas for their economy, even with the report that came out, the IPCC report that came out that said that, we have about 10 years left. I just read a report about that this morning that showed what Saudi Arabia and Norway pushed back in the negotiations for that report to come out. And I have this feeling, not living in a place that depends on exporting oil and gas, that I'm held hostage to maybe local economic concerns, that the future of the planet will be fine. It's not the future of the planet, it's the future of people on the planet that I'm concerned about. How do you see a path forward where local economic concerns, like McGurk brought up, can be reconciled with greater global crisis concerns?
Absolutely. This is a great question. And I just want to go to what was talked about a few minutes ago with the economics of oil and gas in Alaska, because, so many people have this longstanding perception that Alaska is an oil state. And basically what happened is after the discovery of Prudhoe Bay in 1968, after the construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System in 1977, the state of Alaska rewired its economy to run on oil, right? We don't have an income tax. We don't have a sales tax. We don't fund ourselves like other states. And so over the past few decades, this has been true. But what's really fascinating is that we are actually getting the majority of our income today from earnings on investments, from earnings on the Alaska Permanent Fund, right? This is our sovereign wealth fund. So we are actually more of an endowment state today than we are an oil state. And I'd also add that, this Willow deal is not a good deal for the state of Alaska. We are actually going to be getting less revenue over the next 10 years because of this oil development, because of the way that our oil taxes are structured as a state. So when it comes to transitioning away from that, we've already begun to transition because of the money that we've saved, that oil and gas revenue, we've turned a non-renewable resource into a renewable resource. And Alaska has some of the best renewable resources on the planet, right? We have phenomenal wind. We actually have phenomenal sunshine during the summer, right? When we have almost 24 hours of light in different places in the state. And we have phenomenal geothermal resources. So I'm actually bullish that Alaska can chart a path here towards a sustainable economy while still providing for the needs of its people.
I want to bring in another video comment. This is from Brenna Two Bears. She's with Keep It in the Ground. She's a lead coordinator at the Indigenous Environmental Network. That's IEN. Here, listen to what she has to say.
The Willow Project is the next climate bomb. The building of this pipeline is going to lock the U.S. in for another 30 years at least to unnecessary fossil fuel emissions. The ecological and spiritual damage brought on by this project is not going to be offsetted or supplanted. Instead, it's going to put the food security, health, and identity of 6 Inupiaq villages at risk out there on the northern slope. The Nuxit is one of those Inupiaq villages, and they're already suffering from extreme pollution with the existing oil projects. What's going to happen to them when their caribou disappear? How are they going to supplement their food with local hunting and fishing with nothing to hunt or fish? The Willow Project is only going to devastate because fossil fuels have always and will always increase serious health impacts for Inupiaq and Indigenous communities in the region and around the world. Indigenous lands and communities are not sacrifice zones.
McCrook, she used a phrase there, climate bomb. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, also called the report I referred to earlier, the IPCC report this week, a how-to guide to defuse the climate time bomb. What do you think about Philip's suggestion for all the green energy that Alaska could be producing there? Why not do that rather than extract fossil fuels?
You know, I think that at least for the reason that I represent, you know, whatever the transition looks like and whatever systems that may be available to put in place, it's going to require an investment. We have an opportunity through the revenues that we're going to generate to be able to make those investments ourselves, to be able to decide what systems that we want in place ourselves. Kind of goes back to the idea of self-determination, right? We had to force a seat at the table back in the 1970s to be able to benefit economically from the development that was going to take place. And we have an opportunity to utilize that to generate the revenues to move our communities to the future.
Philip, is there enough gas available right now with the current projects to meet the needs? Or Ngurk brought up in one of his earlier answers that, you know, the transition isn't going to happen for maybe 10 more years and we're going to need oil during that time.
Well, what I would say is that, you know, we have known about climate change in Alaska for decades, right? Ngurk brought up the formation of the North Slope Borough in 1972, fighting for a seat at the table. And one of the key leaders in that transition was a gentleman by the name of Eben Hobson. And Eben Hobson was talking about climate change coming from oil and gas back in the 1970s. So we've known about this for a long time. Alaska had a governor, Steve Cooper, in 1990, who introduced a climate change report to the Alaska legislature. So we have known about this for decades. We have not taken the action that we need to for decades, and now we're suffering the consequences because of that. So I think the logic that you know, it's certainly helpful to have more money, more investment for this transition. But as we look at the global landscape right now, renewables, especially solar, is the cheapest form of energy that we've ever discovered as humanity, right? The scientists have done their job. We have the tools and technology in front of us. And what we need is the political will. And, you know, we really need to be deploying these technologies at scale to decarbonize our economy.
All right, here's another comment from YouTube. It says, are they ready for another Trump era? Because Biden will lose young voters, especially after going back on his promise to protect the climate. And I want to bring in one more video comment from our community. This is from Jade Begay, the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the NDN Collective.
We are, of course, very concerned about the impacts to the local Indigenous community and tribes that live nearest where the Willow Project will be built and expanded. Not only that, but we are really concerned about what this means for Indigenous communities across the world, because we know that climate change does not happen in a vacuum. this definitely puts us well beyond that 1.5 target, meaning more catastrophe for vulnerable populations like Indigenous communities, rural communities, and low-income communities.
Polly, do you?
And
yeah, jump in, go for it.
Yeah. So one of the things that I really want to make sure is understood in the context of this issue is that colonization and America saying, with or without you, we are going to develop this land, and the indigenous leaders of the Arctic, forcing a seat at the table, I think needs to be a part of this conversation because context does matter. And capitalism and colonization have deeply impacted indigenous communities. And so we see that here today. And so you have indigenous communities who are reliant on these oil and gas funds because the federal government forced this development, forced with or without the voice of indigenous people, this development would have happened. And so when we're talking about that, I think that that needs to be a part of the conversation as well. And then also when we're talking about green energy, there are conversations now about lithium mining and
Polly,
how close those are to
you couldn't be more
communities.
prescient. That's tomorrow's show on the stream. We're doing lithium. Yeah, for people like me that drive an electric car, we've been talking about oil and gas this week. Well, tomorrow's my turn to get it with the lithium question. I'm glad you brought that up. But Nagurk, I want to give you a chance to respond to Polly. Do you feel like this is forced upon you by colonization and the U.S. government?
I mean, I think at the time in the 70s, they were going to drill with or without us. They were going to extract the resources off the North Slope. And in order for us to provide for our communities, they set up the North Slope Borough. Our early leaders set up the North Slope Borough and knew that there was going to be the revenue that was made available. We were actually sued by the oil companies as well as the state of Alaska and won that suit in court to be able to develop the North Slope Borough and have been providing for our communities ever since. And it is an important context that we were forced into the situation that we're in now with the borough, with the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, and we're utilizing the tools that were made available to us to do the best that we can to support the people, our constituents in the different regions across the state.
Given the choice, if you had another choice, like someone was offering you an equal amount of money for a green energy project there, would you take that?
I mean, I think that we're open to any ideas to replace the revenue, right? We could replace the energy probably a lot easier than we can replace that revenue, right? So you can't have one without the other necessarily, because then you just thrust communities back into potential poverty. They might not be able to pay that energy bill, doesn't matter where it comes from. So you need the economy to be able to support that.
Hey, real quick, we got less than 2 minutes here, Philip. We did a show yesterday about a new pipeline project in Uganda and Tanzania. What is the rest of the world supposed to think when they look at the U.S. starting new fossil fuel projects while kind of wagging the finger at places like Uganda saying don't add to climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the Biden administration in the U.S., I think, have lost a significant amount of leverage and credibility with this decision. At the same time, we also have the Biden administration passing the most ambitious and aggressive climate legislation in U.S. history with the Inflation Reduction Act. What we can certainly say is that we know that there's a carbon budget. We know there's a certain amount of oil and gas that we can burn before we exceed these planetary tipping points, right? You often hear about 2 degrees Celsius referred to. And with the Willow Project, ConocoPhillips has pegged this at about $58 a barrel, which is relatively high cost oil. And this is oil that's going to be produced in the 2030s, 2040s, well into the 2050s. And so what we know with this project is that, the folks who are developing this are planning on there being a lot more oil and gas in the future and not keeping to the carbon budget that the scientists say that we need to stick to.
That's going to be our final word. I want to thank all 3 of our guests for being here with us today. And as Polly perfectly set up for us, tomorrow we're going to be talking about new energy. We're going to look at electrical vehicles and what they need to be more sustainable going forward. So I want to thank you for watching today, and hopefully we'll see you on the show tomorrow.